April 15th is ASL Day, and April 13th through the 19th is Deaf Queer Awareness Week. So let's talk about the world-renowned sociolinguist and deaf activist who's credited with, among other things, introducing the idea that the deaf community is bilingual. Dr. Barbara Kannapell. Welcome back to Yesterqueers. My name's Amanda, and I'm a public historian of queer history. Barbara Marie Kannapell, Canny to her friends, was born September 14th, 1937 in Louisville, Kentucky. As the deaf child of a deaf family, Kannapell was part of a vibrant deaf community. She used ASL at home, but at the insistence of her hearing grandmother, Kannapell was sent to the Louisville Oral Deaf School starting at age 4. Oralism is an educational approach that forces deaf and hard of hearing children to focus on developing their lip reading and speech skills rather than on learning and using sign language. Thanks to Alexander Graham Bell and a whole slew of other hearing educators, oralism was the gold standard for educating deaf children from the late 1800s until the mid-20th century. And unfortunately, it is still the educational method preferred by many hearing parents of deaf children. Students at oral deaf schools were subject to a variety of abuses. For example, they were not permitted to use sign language in the classrooms, which meant that not only were their hands beaten with rulers if they were caught signing, but also any information that they missed while lip reading, they simply never learned. When Canny was 10, the principal of her school slapped her when she was unable to correctly pronounce United States. It's perhaps not surprising then that Kannapell grew up to be one of the fiercest critics of oralism and devoted her life to battling autism as a linguist, as an educator, and as an activist. After graduating from the Indiana School for the Deaf in 1956, she earned her bachelor's degree in deaf education and her master's in education technology from Gallaudet. And in 1985, she became the first deaf person ever to earn a doctoral degree in sociolinguistics from Georgetown University. Barbara Kannapell was the first person to argue in a 1973 paper that bilingualism should be applied to deaf people because ASL was not simply a distorted form of English. She is a huge part of the reason that ASL is now recognized as a unique visual language with its own specific grammar and syntax, and why deaf people who speak, write, or read English in addition to signing are understood to be bilingual. She was also the first to formally identify and research deaf culture, which is defined by the World Federation of the Deaf as the beliefs, attitudes, history, norms, values, literary traditions, and art shared by those who were deaf. Kannapell used every outlet available to her, speaking engagements and presentations, workshops, interviews, articles, letters, to advocate for the human right of deaf people to their culture and language, both in the United States and around the world. To quote Roberta Cordano, the president of Gallaudet, Dr. Barbara Kannapell was years, if not decades, ahead of her time in every way. At a time when sign language was significantly doubted, devalued, and undermined as important for learning and language development, she was one of the first to research and posit the importance of American Sign Language for all deaf children and adults. But Kannapell wasn't just ahead of her time when it came to deaf education and activism. She was also an out lesbian and an advocate for the deaf queer community. Kannapell and her wife, Mary Eileen Paul, met around 1970 in Washington, D.C.'s most popular disco, Pier 9. Now, Washington, D.C. had very strict liquor laws at the time that forbade people from walking around with drinks. You had to sit in one place to drink them. So the owners at Pier 9 installed phones at all the tables to allow their patrons to continue to flirt and cruise while they were enjoying their drinks. Eileen spotted Canny across the bar and called her table, but of course Canny and her friends couldn't hear the phone and didn't answer it. The two did eventually meet on the dance floor and communicated by writing notes back and forth until Eileen learned ASL. It was Eileen's journey to learn ASL that led to the founding of Deaf Pride, Inc. Eileen and a Black woman named Ann Wilson, whose son was deaf, were in class together and realized they were not learning the language that they saw the deaf community using and were instead being taught to sign exact English. Remember how I said ASL has its own grammar and syntax? When they confronted the instructor about it, their concerns were brushed off. Anne had already created a group called Parents for Deaf Pride to advocate for Black deaf children, and in 1972, she partnered with Eileen and Canny to expand the group's initiative. The three of them founded Deaf Pride, Inc. to advocate for the deaf residents of Washington, D.C., particularly Black, Latino, poor, queer, and other marginalized deaf people who were being underserved. Their three main objectives were to make the healthcare system more accessible to deaf people, especially deaf mothers and children, to help deaf people access substance abuse programs, and to help deaf people navigate the legal system, including training interpreters to function in courtrooms and other legal settings. They also successfully lobbied the government of the District of Columbia to recognize ASL as a language, which helped clear away some of the barriers that deaf people were facing in accessing services. Barbara and Eileen, meanwhile, had a commitment ceremony in 1996 and married formally in 2013 when same-sex marriage became legal in Washington, D.C. They had been together for 50 years when Dr. Barbara Kannapell died on August 11th, 2021, at the age of 83. That's it for today. As always, more information, including sources and further reading, is available in the usual place.